Hello and welcome to Lecture 2 on the Renaissance. Last time I just gave some historical background on the general historical era of the Renaissance, and then I talked about some musical aspects, specific characteristics of music in the Renaissance. These are outlined for you on pages 81 and 82. And now we're going to get into talking about the different genres of music in the Renaissance. And as we did with the music of the Middle Ages, we want to sort of keep them straight, keep track of them. And I think the best way to organize this is to have two separate headings and maybe have your sacred genres on the one side and your secular genres on the other side. We still have this division between sacred and secular music. But what is interesting and what is an outgrowth of the late Middle Ages, do you remember how in the lecture on the late Middle Ages when I talked about the Ars Nova period, and I remarked how the two leading composers of that time, Francesco Landini in Italy and Guillaume de Machaut in France, both spent more time and energy writing secular music rather than sacred music. And this is kind of a new thing that is characteristic of the later Middle Ages. So overall in the Middle Ages, most serious trained composers were priests, and therefore most music that was important enough to be written down was going to be sacred music, in part because the only people who would know how to write music down would be trained and would be working for the church, would be priests, etc. We get to the later Middle Ages, and we get to the period where the nobility takes an interest in art and literature and music and dancing and the finer things in life. And some of them become sort of amateur composer, songwriter, poets, right? The troubadours. But when we get to the Ars Nova, which is just basically the last 100 years or so of the Middle Ages, we have professional composers like Landini, like Machaut, and even a priest, as Machaut was, who spend more time and energy composing secular music rather than sacred. Right? Landini in particular, there is no surviving sacred music by Landini at all. It's possible he never composed any sacred music. And for Machaut, there is that one very important work, the Mass of Notre Dame, that seems to have been the only sacred work he ever composed. Again, as far as we know. Spent most of his time composing secular love songs of one kind or another. So we had this increasing secularization of sort of the general society, which of course influences music and culture and everything else. This trend continues on into the Renaissance. So in the Renaissance, most of our major composers composed both sacred music and secular music. But if we find a composer that really does only one and not the other, it's more likely that they're going to compose only secular music and not sacred music. And moreover, the more prestigious position to get, I think I mentioned this last time, if you were a professional composer and you had your choice to work either for a royal court, working for some powerful, wealthy nobleman, or working for the church, you would choose to work for the nobleman, most likely, because that was a more prestigious, higher paying position. You had more flexibility. You had the possibility of composing both sacred and secular music, because of course the nobility also liked to have sacred music. They had their own chapels very often on the grounds of their palace. And so they needed composers to create not only sacred music for them, but also secular music. Whereas if you're working for the church, you're just going to be composing sacred music. So we have two categories, just as we had in the Middle Ages. But in the Renaissance, our two major genres of sacred music will be the Mass and the Motet. and I'll explain what those are in a moment. We have three major genres of secular music, at least that we're going to study for the purposes of this class. The most important one is the madrigal, but we also have something called the lute song, and we have an example of a lute song in your book. And then we also have this sort of general category of instrumental music for dancing. Right? We had instrumental music for dancing back in the Middle Ages too. Remember the estampillé, and this was some of the earliest instrumental music that was written down. Right? We have more. There are different types of dances, but we have more of that being written down in the Renaissance. Keep in mind, of course, that the availability of printing for music now greatly increases the volume of written sheet music all over the place, so that it's no longer such a specialized thing to write down a piece of music on paper. It doesn't have to be done by hand. Paper is more widely available now because we have a printing industry. There's a demand for paper and people willing to supply it. There's more like ink. There's more people who can read and write music now. So there's just far more written music available. And that means even instrumental music, even lowly dance music, is considered worth writing down. Right? Okay, so today we're going to focus mostly on sacred music, on the Mass and the Motet, and we're going to talk about two composers in particular, Josquin de Prez and Giovanni Pierluigi de Palestrina, who is considered the greatest composer of the late Renaissance. Josquin is early Renaissance, Palestrina is late Renaissance. And we have an example of one of these works in these genres. We have a motet by Josquin and then a movement from a mass by Palestrina. All right. Let's talk first about what a mass is. And this is a little bit review because we've already seen an example of a mass, that is, as a musical genre, not as the ceremony within the Catholic Church, but as a musical genre. Remember when I talked about Guillaume de Machaut, again, back in the late Middle Ages, in the Ars Nova period, we looked at his Mass of Notre Dame, Mass for Our Lady, and the book said, was historically significant because it was the first polyphonic treatment of the complete Mass Ordinary by a known composer. So what this means is Josquin was the first to take those 5 ordinary prayers of the Mass, the prayers which don't change from one day to the next in the Catholic Church calendar. The Kyrie, the Gloria, the Credo, the Sanctus, and the Agnus Dei. Machaut seems to have been the first to look at those 5 texts and say this could be the basis for a unified 5-movement composition. And here we have to perhaps explain what a multi-movement composition is, because this is something you might not be familiar with if you listen mostly to popular music. In popular music, if you turn on the radio, what do you hear? A song, right? And this, by the way, leads a lot of people to think of any piece of music, they just call it a song. Within the quote-unquote classical music world, a song is something specific. We have heard some examples of songs, but not every piece of music is a song. Some pieces of music are symphonies or sonatas or operas or motets. So even something which has singing in it is not necessarily a song. And pieces for instruments are just about never called songs within the classical world. There's some kind of an instrumental piece, like a sonata or a suite or what have you. And the other thing about popular music, everything is a song, and they are all individual single movement works, right? There's a song, it comes on the radio, it lasts for 4 minutes, and then there's another song by somebody else. And it might have a certain structure, which I've talked about as well, but it isn't a single chapter in some larger work. Now, there are some exceptions to this. So, some of you might be familiar with this thing called the concept album, which was very kind of popular in the 70s and 80s. For example, Pink Floyd The Wall is a concept album where the entire album has sort of an overarching story or concept, and each of the different songs fit into that overall story. And therefore, you could look at a concept album like The Wall and say, well, it's really a multi-movement work. There's one overall work, and it has different movements, which are different songs. That isn't true for most albums, I don't think. Most albums are just, the album is a convenient packaging device, and there isn't necessarily a theme to it or an overarching story. It's just that a musician comes out with some songs, and they put them in a package, just kind of like for marketing purposes, and call it an album, and there you go. But in the classical world, very often, music is multi-movement. And in the case of the Mass, we have 5 movements, which are kind of like 5 chapters of a book. Each movement has a beginning and an ending, and you could listen to just an individual movement and might think it's perfectly fine, maybe not even realizing that it is but a single movement of a larger work. Just like in a book, you could read an individual chapter of a book, and it might even sort of work on its own as a short story. It has a beginning and an ending, and then you move on to the next chapter. That's what is analogous to the multi-movement work in classical music. So for example, when we get to the symphony in a future era, in the classical era, a symphony is almost always a 4-movement work. A concerto is almost always a 3-movement work. The Mass ordinary, is almost always a 5-movement work because there are 5 prayers in the ordinary of the Mass. And Josquin, Machaut was the first composer, as far as we know, to look at those 5 movements and say, aha, we could create a unified multi-movement work based on the Mass. He was the first of countless composers. That's why it is of historical significance. Machaut was the first, but composers all through the Renaissance and the Baroque and the Classical era, the Romantic era, on up to the present day, have been following in Machaut's footsteps and composing masses. So, for example, the first composer of the Renaissance we'll look at, Josquin, composed many, many masses. Palestrina, we have an excerpt from what is his most famous mass, the Pope Marcellus Mass. Palestrina composed over 100 masses. He set those same words to music over 100 times, 100 different ways. When we get to the Baroque era, J.S. Bach, greatest composer of the Baroque era. Most musicians consider him to be the greatest composer of all time. He wasn't even Catholic. He was a Lutheran, but he too composed one of the greatest masses in music history, the B minor Mass. Because although he wasn't Catholic, the Mass was an important genre, and if you were a serious, important composer, you're kind of obliged to do that, right? Just like if you were a serious, important composer of the classical era, you would be kind of obliged, you would be expected to compose a symphony or an opera. Speaking of the classical era, the 3 great classical masters, Haydn, Mozart, and Beethoven, all composed masses. And on really up to the present day. One of my favorite masses, actually, is by the Estonian composer Arvo Pärt. Maybe I'll put a link to it somewhere or put it on one of my playlists. Composed in, I believe, 1992, his Berlin Mass. Wonderful piece of music. I guarantee somewhere right now on planet Earth, probably more than one place, there is a composer writing a Mass, doing exactly what, not in the same style necessarily, but exactly the same kind of thing that Machaut first did, about 700 years ago or so. Okay, so that's what a Mass is. A Mass is a musical setting, that is a musical Mass, as distinct from the Catholic liturgy Mass, the ceremony that goes on Sundays in a Catholic church. The musical genre of the Mass is simply a setting of the text of the ordinary prayers to music. What is a motet? A motet is also a sacred text set to music, usually in a polyphonic texture with many lines of melody going on simultaneously. But a motet is a shorter work. It might only be about 5 or 6 minutes long. I mean, it could be a little bit longer, but a mass is usually, maybe something like 20 minutes, a half hour long, because there are 5 separate movements. A motet is a single movement work, and it will be based on some sacred text which is not necessarily part of the liturgy. In fact, it probably won't be part of the liturgy. It will be some other sacred text. It could just be a Bible verse. Or in the case of this motet by Josquin, it's an Ave Maria. It's a prayer to the Virgin Mary. It's not the traditional Hail Mary that you might be familiar with as a Catholic, but it starts out with those same words, Hail Mary, full of grace, and then it goes on from there. In the case of this particular motet by Josquin, I believe it is not known who wrote the words to it. It's possible Josquin wrote the words himself, but in the Renaissance, it was more often the case, whether we're talking about sacred music or secular music, it was more often the case that the composer did not write the words. A poet would write the words, or the words would already pre-existing from some source, like the Bible or the Catholic liturgy, and the composer would come along and set them to music. We'll see this more of this as we talk about secular music of the Renaissance. The madrigal, for example, is there were poets who wrote madrigal texts who maybe had nothing to do with the music, but they were in the business of writing madrigal texts, which composers would then purchase and set to music. Anyway, so our 2 genres of sacred music, the Mass and the motet. The Mass is larger, it is multi-movement. The motet is a single movement work, it's shorter, based on some text which is probably not part of the liturgy, but is nonetheless of a religious or devotional nature. So let's talk about the 2 composers that are featured under sacred music. Remember, there were not just 2 composers of sacred music in the Renaissance. There were hundreds, thousands probably. It was a long period of time. It's 150 years from 1450 to 1600, and there's a great deal of musical activity going on, so there are many, many composers, but we're just going to focus on 2. The greatest composer of the early Renaissance, Josquin des Près, and the person considered probably the greatest composer of the late Renaissance, Palestrina. Josquin des Près, if you look at that name, you say, well, that looks kind of vaguely French or Dutch or something. And it is. And this is something worth noting. Many, if not most, of the great composers of the Renaissance came from this region of Europe, basically up in the northwest corner of Europe there, which is sometimes referred to as the Franco-Flemish region. And these composers are sometimes called the Franco-Flemish school. Again, school does not mean like a university or an elementary school. It means a group of composers who are working at the same time in a similar style in a given region, and therefore kind of have an influence on each other. So the Franco-Flemish region, well, that would be northern France into Belgium and Holland, the modern-day Netherlands, right? And this is really where the leading composers came from, although they then spread and worked at courts all over Europe. So particularly, let's say, in Italy, right? Italy was where really it was sort of like the nexus of the Renaissance. That's really where the Renaissance kind of took off as a cultural phenomenon, where these Italian princes sort of vying with each other for having the most magnificent court with the most magnificent art, the greatest composers, etc. So Josquin, for example, whom we usually refer to by his first name, we call him Josquin rather than Desprez. Josquin, although born in this region of like the Netherlands, basically, worked for much of his life in Italy. The style of these Northern French or Netherlands composers spreads throughout Europe and becomes the kind of like accepted style, the leading musical style of the Renaissance in Europe. And since they travel to Italy, that style is then picked up by Italian composers. And by the way, there's some, I believe it is the case that it is thought that these French and Netherlands composers, in turn, were influenced by the English, and that it was probably a result of the 100 Years' War between France and England, which went actually for more than 100 years, from, I believe, the 1320s all the way to 1453. That same momentous year, 1453, was also when the 100 Years' War between France and England was concluded. Well, what does that have to do with music? Well, the kings of France, the various kings of France, of England, who fought in France, right? The 100 Years' War was fought completely on the continent in France rather than in England. But if you're a king of England and you're fighting in France, or if you're a king of wherever and you're fighting in some foreign country, you would actually bring, your retinue, your entourage, your courtiers with you, including your musicians. And so there seems to have been some influence of the English on the French and on the Belgians or the Dutch or whatever as a result of the 100 Years' War. Because this distinctive sound, for example, the preference for the interval of a third, which I talked about last time, the sound of triads, right, seems to have come from the English. It was referred to in those days as the English sound or the English countenance, right? So this Renaissance sound might have originated in England, spread over to just across the channel into modern-day Netherlands and France, and from there throughout the rest of Europe. Okay, so Josquin, born around 1450. We don't really know exactly when he was born, and this is the case with many people from that long ago. But by the time he died, he was famous enough that we do know for sure what year he died, 1521. In fact, his death was marked by other composers paying tribute to him. In those days, when a great composer died, other composers would often write a certain specific kind of piece called a deploration, basically expressing the fact that they deplore, they are lamenting the death of this other composer. And Josquin was held in such high regard by all of his contemporaries that there were these kinds of pieces, these deplorations, sort of like tributes to Josquin, written upon the occasion of his death. Josquin des Prez, a contemporary of Leonardo da Vinci and Christopher Columbus, was a master of Renaissance music. Like many Flemish composers, that is, again, from this region, Flemish refers to Flanders, by the way, which is a region in modern-day Belgium. He was born in the province of Hainaut, today part of Belgium, and spent much of his life in Italy, serving in dukes' private chapels and in the papal choir at Rome. Interesting side note about the papal choir in Rome. Okay, so if you're the Pope in Rome, and you have obviously your own musicians, your own choir, and you would perform the personal chapel of the Pope in those days was the Sistine Chapel. You're all familiar with the paintings by Michelangelo on the roof of the Sistine Chapel. Maybe some of you have been there. Well, Josquin was a singer in the choir of the Sistine Chapel, and this was at a time when I think the choir had maybe only 15 or 20 singers in it. It's a fairly small choir. It's not like a big giant choir. It's, let's say maybe it's a dozen or two singers, but you can be sure they would be a dozen or two of the best singers in Europe. So Josquin must have been an excellent singer to have gotten that job. Well, back in the 1990s, I believe, the Sistine Chapel was completely sort of renovated. And famously, they uncovered a lot of this sort of soot and grime off of the ceiling where Michelangelo's famous paintings are. And they also kind of went over the choir loft, so this area above the chapel where the choir would sing. And there was a tradition in the Sistine Chapel of the singers in the choir. They would all carve their name into the wooden paneling of that choir loft. Right? So there are hundreds and hundreds of signatures up there, and Josquin's is one of them. As they were working on the Sistine Chapel, they discovered Josquin's signature carved into the wood, and I believe it's the only instance we have of his actual signature. I'm pretty sure it's his. It says Josquin. Anyway, so he sang in the choir of the Sistine Chapel, served in Duke's private chapels. In later years, he worked for Louis XII of France and held several church posts in his native land. There's an interesting anecdote about Josquin. I believe it was one of these Italian dukes who hired him. I think it was maybe the Duke of Ferrara. We actually have this correspondence between the Duke and one of his assistants, and they're talking about which composer they should hire. They're in the process of hiring a new composer, and there are sort of like job applications coming in. And the Duke wants only the best. And his assistant, his secretary, writing him a letter, said, well, we've gotten applications from several different people. Josquin wants more money than anybody else. We think we should hire somebody else because Josquin wants too much money. Well, this Duke went ahead and hired Josquin anyway, even though he wanted like twice as much money as the next most expensive composer. So that, again, shows the high regard that people had in his time. There's a quote here from Martin Luther himself in praise of Josquin. And Martin Luther says, God has his gospel preached also through the medium of music, and this may be seen from the compositions of Josquin, all of whose works are cheerful, gentle, mild, and lovely. They flow and move along, and are neither forced nor coerced and bound by rigid and stringent rules, but on the contrary, are like the song of the finch. This is an interesting observation by Martin Luther, who was a very musically astute and well-trained person, had some definite ideas on music, as with other things he had definite ideas on. So Luther is praising Josquin, basically saying that his music sounds natural, unforced, unbound by rigid rules. Actually, there were kind of rigid rules in the Renaissance. This musical style, which if you're a music major, you go to grad school, you might take classes in what is sometimes called, in Renaissance counterpoint, in composing in this polyphonic technique, which is very difficult, and there are sort of like rules, and the rules exist for a reason. They're not just arbitrary rules, but there are rules. But the secret, I think, to greatness, which Martin Luther is picking up on here, is that it doesn't sound like he's following rules. It sounds natural and unforced, not like the rule says I have to go this way with this melody, so that's what I'm going to do. Right? It sounds natural and inevitable. Right? Okay, so Josquin composed all different kinds of pieces. He composed sacred music with a Latin text, and he composed all kinds of like love songs in various vernacular languages like Italian and French. The book chooses to use as its example this motet called Ave Maria, Virgo Serena, Hail Mary, Serene Virgin. And this is a 4-voice motet, so we have 4 layers of melody going on, like soprano, alto, tenor, bass. Right. When this was performed, it probably would have been performed by all male voices. Like the soprano part probably would have been a boy soprano. It can be performed by a mixed choir today, men and women. But being that it is a sacred work and it might be sung in a chapel, it would probably be sung by all male voices. Notice if you look at, in your listening guide, you have this in your book. I'm just going to stick my old-fashioned book up to the camera for a second here. And you'll see that even if you can't read music, so you've got 4 lines of music going on. And if you look at the pattern of notes, it doesn't matter if you can read the notes or not, but if you look at the pattern, you can see that each time a new voice appears, and we have first the soprano, then the alto, then the tenor making its entrance, and then the bass, the shape of the melody is the same. It sounds like this. Right, so this is what we might call sort of like a motive. It is a melodic snippet of special significance because it is taken up by the other voices in turn. This is what we call imitative counterpoint. Notice that as the soprano, the highest voice, sings Ave Maria, the other voices are resting. That's what those little black squares are. Each part has its own notation. The lower voices have to rest. So we have soprano, and then alto, and then below that, as that alto voice is coming in, we have a tenor voice entering, and then finally the bass. They all enter with that same melody, and the melody is sort of like overlapped against itself. Right? This is, again, imitative counterpoint. Not only is the texture polyphonic, it is imitative. And this is difficult to do because not only do you have to come up with a nice sounding melody that sounds good by itself, you have to come up with a melody that sounds good when layered against itself in sort of a staggered way. Right? And I'm not going to play the recording here on the lecture. You can certainly find it in my playlists, or get it out of the textbook. Just click on it there, and there's a listening guide. And notice how, as the book points out, Josquin skillfully varies the texture of this motet. Sometimes 2, sometimes 3 or 4 voices are heard at a time. Just because you have 4 different lines of music available to you doesn't mean that they have to all be going all the time. Sometimes it makes sense to have only 2 going at a time, sometimes 3, sometimes 4, right? And a lot of times it might depend on what the text has, because remember, a composer like Josquin, or any decent Renaissance composer, is trying to express the meaning of the text musically as much as possible. And there are several examples of this which are described in the listening guide for this piece. The structure of this text is basically we have 6 sort of stanzas, I guess, 4-line groups of text, and then we have this very special 2-line group at the end that I want to talk about. So, first 4 lines. Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with thee, serene virgin. And we have this imitation that I talked about at the very beginning. Then we have our second verse. The words are, Hail, whose conception, full of great jubilation, fills heaven and earth with new joy. So we've got jubilation and joy going on. And so, as the book says, we have increased rhythmic activity and animation, kind of expressing this joy. And you can hear the second verse is more joyful, more expressive. It's not quite as laid back as the first. Now, all of this, by the way, it's all very, as Martin Luther says, it's all very mild. It's not overly expressive, right? In Renaissance music, especially sacred music, the ideal that the composer is striving towards is more about pure beauty of sound and expressing in a sort of restrained, tasteful way the meaning of the words. It's not supposed to like tear your heart out or something. The expression of raw emotion is not the goal here, right? It is kind of trying to conform to a specific idea about beauty, pure beauty. That's the most important thing. Expressing the meaning of the words is the next most important thing, but we don't want to overdo it, right? Especially in a sacred work, it should be very subtle and not too obvious. When we get to secular pieces, composers were often much more obvious in their attempts to express the meaning of the words. But in a sacred work like this, it is sort of more appropriate to be sort of like more dignified and restrained and subtle. Okay, so third verse. Now this one is a little, the text you might find a little puzzling. Hail, again, Hail Mary, Ave. Each verse starts out with that word Ave. Hail Mary, whose birth brought us joy, as Lucifer, the morning star, went before the true sun. Now, what is Lucifer doing in a poem of praise to the Virgin Mary? Lucifer is not Satan, is not the devil. That's a name that was given to the devil much later. Lucifer in this context means light bearer. That's what the word means. The luz, like that's the Latin word for, or at least related to the Latin root for light, which is lux. Lucifer means the bringer of light. Okay, who is the bringer of light? The bringer of light is the morning star. What is the morning star? The morning star is the planet Venus, which is also the evening star, depending on what time of year it is. But if you have ever looked out into the sky, like either, depending on the time of year, around sunset or around sunrise, and if you look where the sun is, either before it's coming up in the morning or maybe just as it's going down at night, you might see this what appears to be a very bright star. In fact, it's so bright you might think, oh, is that an airplane? Oh, wait a minute, no, that's a star. That's the planet Venus. And you only see it either at sunrise or at sunset because it is closer to the sun than we are. So if the sun is setting, then Venus will be setting with it from our perspective. Or if the sun is rising, you might see Venus rising first before the true sun. So what this is, it's an elaborate metaphor. Whoever wrote these words, Josquin or somebody else, is saying Mary's birth, and notice, her birth in the order of the poem comes after her conception, right? The Immaculate Conception you may have heard of. It does not refer to the birth of Jesus. It refers to the birth of Mary, who was born without sin, unique among human beings, right? At least up to that point. So Mary is conceived immaculately, and then her birth is sort of it comes before the true sun, sort of like the morning star, Lucifer, comes before the sun, at least, depending on the time of year, like Venus rising like a star before the true sun. Who is the sun? Of course, the Son of God, Jesus, right? So how is this illustrated in the music? It's done ingeniously. It says here, high duet imitated by a low duet. So we have a duet, and then an imitation of that duet that comes along later in time, sort of like Venus rising and then the sun rising. So the very thing that the text is talking about is happening in the musical texture. It's a very subtle kind of thing. Again, you might not realize it until your music professor explains it to you. But in Josquin's day, again, this is a time when audiences were pretty sophisticated. The kind of people who would be listening to this music would be well-educated in music, and they might well pick up on that and say, hey, listen to what he's doing there. Listen to how the music is doing the exact same thing that is described in the words, all of which is an elaborate metaphor for Mary as being sort of a necessary precondition. The conception and the birth of Mary is a necessary precondition to the birth of Jesus, right? Then we have a brief pause, and we have the second group of 3 verses, right? And you can read I'm not going to go through the entire text. I want to go now to the very last 2 lines. Now, up until this point, the texture has been polyphonic, and each individual melodic line is more or less independent than the others. Sometimes they're often imitating each other. They are sometimes in pairs or whatever, but it is polyphonic texture. These last 2 lines are in something more like homophonic texture, because although we have people singing different pitches, they're all singing in the same rhythm. And what they sing is, O Mother of God, remember me, Amen. O Mater Dei, memento mei, Amen. And what this does, it has the effect of saying, it makes it something, instead of sort of formal, a formal prayer to the Virgin Mary and extolling all of her virtues. At the very end, it's like an individual making a plea to the Virgin Mary. And this is common. You might not be familiar with this concept if you're not Catholic, but asking for intercession, asking for a saint or for the Virgin Mary to intercede on your behalf, like look out for me, all right? And that's exactly what's happening here. It's almost like now that this formal prayer is over with, the individual, one person from their heart is making this plea to Mary. O Mother of God, remember me personally. Amen. All right. So this is just one of the things that I love about Renaissance music, the way that, again, and it might take repeated listenings, or it might take an explanation in a book like this, but not only does it sound so beautiful, and I think Renaissance music is the most purely beautiful music that I know of, but it expresses the text in such a wonderful and yet subtle way. Okay, so listen to that Josquin. I think you'll like it if you haven't listened to it already, and you might like even more the next piece, which I'm going to talk about, and that is the Pope Marcellus Mass by Palestrina. I'll talk a little bit about Palestrina, but this particular movement that they use as a listening example in your book, the Kyrie from the Pope Marcellus Mass, is maybe, I think, the single most beautiful piece of music that I know of. So I heartily recommend it to you. It might not be to your taste. I mean, but in terms of just sheer beauty above all else, I really can't think of anything that tops it. So about Palestrina, it says here, during the 16th century, Italian composers attained the excellence of such earlier Flemish musicians as Josquin des Prez. So I mentioned this. The great composers of the earlier Renaissance tended to come out of northern France, the Netherlands, we call them the Franco-Flemish school, but they spread throughout. They got jobs throughout Europe, and especially the greatest of them, like Josquin, the ones who could command the highest pay or whatever, because they had the highest reputation, they went to Italy because that's where the action was at, really, in the Renaissance, right? That's where you have these princes who want to spend money on their courts, etc. So now we have a native-born Italian composer, Palestrina, born right around the time that Josquin died. So Josquin dies in 1521. We're not exactly sure when Palestrina was born. Again, we know when he died because by that time he was famous, and that date is marked, but we're not positive when he was born. We think around 1525. And Palestrina is definitely recognized as the greatest composer of the late Renaissance, just the same way that Josquin was of the early Renaissance. And it says here, Palestrina devoted himself to music for the Catholic Church. His career was thus centered in Rome, where he held important church positions, including music director for St. Peter's. So basically the top job in the Catholic Church itself. However, Palestrina, like other Renaissance composers, did not compose only sacred music. The book says his career was devoted to music music for the Catholic Church. And that was his later career. Earlier in his career, he actually did compose love songs. And he was apparently kind of embarrassed about this. He kind of downplayed this fact. But he too composed secular music. It's just that we know much more. We tend to know him better for his sacred music, right? Which included 104 masses and some 450 other sacred works. And they say that Palestrina's music is best understood against the background of the Counter-Reformation. Okay, so I briefly mentioned in the first Renaissance lecture what the Counter-Reformation was. It was the Catholic Church's attempt to reform itself and strengthen itself as a reaction to the Reformation, which was initiated by Martin Luther and John Calvin and Henry VIII, these breakaway Protestant churches. As the Catholic Church began to recognize the crisis that it was dealing with, losing so much of its flock to these various Protestant churches, it did undertake a project of reform. And I think I also mentioned that the first step in this process was the holding a meeting. Any large organization, if they're going to reform, they have to hold a meeting. And in this case, that meeting was the Council of Trent, which lasted for 18 years. The various bishops and cardinals gathered on and off in Trent. I mean, they weren't sitting in one conference room for 18 years, but probably felt that way at the time. One of the things, now they as you can imagine, a bunch of cardinals and bishops sitting down talking about reforms to this 1,000-year-old institution, the Catholic Church, for 18 years. They're going to talk about a variety of different things. And they did talk about music at some point. And apparently some of the more conservative cardinals and bishops, first of all, there was discussion about the use of instruments in church, which was beginning to sort of happen against the rules, right? And there was sort of a general complaint about the theatricality, the superfluous complexity, perhaps, of the church music of the time, right? Remember, the idea of church music, going back to Gregorian chant all the way at the beginning, is that it should heighten the experience of prayer, but it should really be for the purpose of prayer, of worshiping God. We shouldn't be creating music just because it sounds good, because we enjoy the way it sounds. Now, that might seem strange, but think about it. If you are listening to a piece of music in church and you're thinking, wow, this just sounds so beautiful, that's amazing what the composer is doing with this or that, instead of thinking about, worshiping God, then you're being distracted, right? So this was the problem that many of these conservative clerics had. They said the music of today, especially this polyphonic music, it's too busy, it's too complex, it's too distracting, and these composers are really just kind of like showing off their skill. Which is kind of like a selfish, worldly thing, right? Or let's say a vain, prideful thing, rather than, again, adhering to the original purpose of church music, which is to worship God. And so there were some, again, of these conservative clerics who wanted to go back to strict monophonic Gregorian chant. They said, we've got to get rid of this polyphonic texture. Because for another thing, you can't understand the words as easily. If you have 4 or 5 or 6 different lines, different musical lines going on, this polyphonic texture, and they're all singing the same words, they're all singing the sacred texts, but not in the same rhythm and not with the same melodic shape, so that some people are singing, Kyrie over here, and other people are singing Kyrie here, while these people were singing Eleison or whatever. The text is becoming muddled. In fact, this sacred text, the Word of God, is now just sort of like a means to an end. It's something the composer uses to show off his technique and his skill and his cleverness with the notes, right? So that was sort of the argument against polyphonic texture. There were some people who were against it, who wanted to do away with it altogether. Now, according to legend, and sadly, I guess scholars have determined that this isn't necessarily really true, but according to legend, Palestrina, when he heard about this debate that was going on and that they might do away with polyphonic texture altogether and go back to the plain old Gregorian chant, he assembled his choir and had them perform this very piece, the Pope Marcellus Mass, for the assembled bishops and cardinals. And they were all so blown away by it that they said, well, what were we thinking? As long as composers will write music as beautiful as this and respect the text and be as restrained and whatever as Palestrina is, I guess we'll allow it, and I guess we'll continue on with polyphonic texture. So the legend is that Palestrina saved polyphony. And again, probably not actually true, probably didn't happen like that, but that is the legend or the myth. Okay, so this whole everything I described is here on page 85, right? And it concludes, the restraint and serenity of Palestrina's works reflect this emphasis on a more spiritual music. For centuries, church authorities had regarded his masses as models of church music because of their calmness and otherworldly quality. Even today, the technical perfection of his style is a model for students of counterpoint. So, for example, when I was in graduate school and I took a class on 16th century counterpoint, Palestrina was basically, you are learning the style of Palestrina. And here's an aspect of his style which you can see again in the very opening melody. This piece, just like Josquin's Motet, features the melody appearing sequentially, first in one voice, and then in another, and then in another, and as it carries on, this melody ends up being layered against itself, making these staggered entrances, imitative counterpoint. The melody itself is very simple. It sounds like this, and it's written out for you, even if you can't read music. At the bottom of page 85, here it is. The opening melody, just the opening phrase of the Kyrie, which is the first movement of the Mass. So we're hearing just the first movement of the Pope Marcellus Mass, one of 104 Masses by Palestrina, and it sounds like this. Now, it's pretty simple. It's just a repeated note. That repeated note, by the way, makes us think it's sort of like an invocation. It's sort of like it's chant-like. This whole melody is essentially chant-like. Notice we repeat this note on Kyrie. We have one leap. That's the only leap. A leap of a fourth. And then we have a scale. Repeated note, down a step and back up. We have it's sort of an ideal balance of types of motion within just a melody. We have a note that is repeated. It's sort of like the attention getter, right? The opening prayer of the Mass. The words the syllables Kyrie are all on the same note. So so far it's kind of monotonous. Just the first three syllables are all on the same note. But then we have a dramatic leap up a fourth. Having leapt up a fourth, which is a fairly large leap, then we fill in the direction that we came from with downward steps. These are among the principles you learn about in this style, that if you have a large leap, you should fill it in and return in the direction of the leap, preferably by step. Same thing if you're approaching the leap. Now, here he approaches the leap by common tone. He repeats that D, and then he leaps up to G. But having leapt up to G, he's not going to continue going up. That would be kind of like against the style. He's going to fill back in the direction that he came. And this helps to preserve range, for one thing. Because remember, these voices, they have to stay within their range. I mean, they can cross each other a little bit occasionally, but if you have 6 different voice parts, as Palestrina does here, then you're going to want to make sure that they kind of stay in their own individual lanes. Right? I had wanted to give an example in the English language, so I'm going to post in one of my playlists. Now, this will not be on the listening ID for the test, but I wanted to, since we're looking at the relationship between words and music, I am going to put something in English for you, and it is a motet by the composer Thomas Tallis, who lived during the 1500s, perhaps the greatest English composer of sacred music during this time. And it is in English. It is the text from whichever of the Gospels it is. It's the new commandment. A new commandment give I unto you. It's Jesus talking to his disciples, giving them the new commandment that you must love one another as I have loved you. And this is, again, one of my favorite pieces of Renaissance choral music. And I'm just going to kind of throw it in there. I'll put a link up to it so that you can listen to it, so you can hear what this might sound like in your own native language. So look for those, and next time we will talk about secular music in the Renaissance, and that will wrap up our unit on the Renaissance, and therefore both the Middle Ages and the Renaissance. See you then.